Welcome back, class. Now we pick up with the second part of this first lecture, which is probably one of the longer lectures we're going to have. We're going to pick up now with a question of the origins of the New Testament documents. Where did they come from? Who wrote them? How did we get them? The traditional view, of course, we're going to look at, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the higher critical view. The traditional view of the four Gospels and the book of Acts is that the first Gospel in our Bible was written by Matthew, the apostle, a former tax collector, also known as Levi. Mark was written by John Mark, an associate of Paul and of Peter, and it is based on Peter's preaching that Mark listened to. Luke and Acts are together a two-volume work. Luke admits at the outset he was not part of the original group, but he was a close associate of Paul, and that he interviewed everybody he could get to find out his information, and he produced this two-volume work. And John is commonly attributed to John the Apostle. None of these works, of course, are autographed. None of them are signed by their authors. And so it is a matter of church tradition that they were written by these men. But your book has a good explanation of details of that. The higher critical view related to the four Gospels and Acts is that, first of all, there was a period of oral tradition of the sayings of Jesus and of the deeds of Jesus that was passed down by word of mouth and through various communities. And then primitive written Gospels were collected and developed. And from that, community efforts began to collect accounts of the life of Jesus. And these were eventually taken and, with some editorial crafting for theological reasons, became the Gospels and the book of Acts that we know today. The same can be said about Paul's letters. There's traditional view and there's a higher critical view. The traditional view is that all that we know of as Paul's letters, except the book of Hebrews, was written by the Apostle Paul. The higher critical view is that about four of Paul's letters, commonly attributed to Paul, were not written by Paul. That Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, okay, that's six, were probably written by someone using Paul's name. The argument on these is that the Christology is too well developed, that the life of the church is too well developed, too defined to be consistent with Paul's lifetime. And that's the bulk of the argument. There's some argument made on linguistic grounds and things like that. But all in all, there doesn't seem to be a good evidential reason for rejecting Paul's authorship of these letters. There's a lot of presupposition that goes into this rejection of these letters as having been written by Paul. There are views on the general epistles and the book of Revelation. The general epistles are everything from Hebrews through the book of Jude. And traditional view is, the ancient view was that Paul wrote Hebrews. Most conservatives don't believe that now. The book of Hebrews is unsigned. We admit we don't know who wrote it. Number of candidates have been put forward. James, written by the Lord's half-brother. 1st and 2nd Peter by Peter, 1st and 2nd and 3rd John by John the Apostle, and Jude by another one of the Lord's half-brothers. The higher critical view accepts the fact that we don't know who wrote Hebrews, accepts the authorship of 1st Peter by Peter, but not 2nd Peter, accepts that James authored the book of James, but rejects Jude's authorship of the book of Jude, and admits, quite candidly, we don't know who wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John because they're not signed. But early church tradition attributes them to John the Apostle. Then there's the issue of the book of Revelation. Two candidates are put forward for this book. One is John the Apostle. Of course, whoever wrote it said that he was John. The question is he John the Apostle, or is he John the Elder, another John in the early church in Asia Minor during the time when tradition says the Apostle John was toward the end of his life? That's an open question. And I tend to think that the Apostle John wrote the book of Revelation, but arguments are made for John the Elder. And some of it's based on a certain reading of patristic evidence, especially from Papias. So that's basically the rundown of how we got different views of how we got the scriptures. The role of bias in approaching the text must be taken into consideration as we talk about traditional versus higher critical views. We all have a bias when we come to the books of the Bible. As a Christian, I believe in God. I believe that Jesus Christ is who he said he was. I believe in the miracles of the Bible and the supernatural and all of that. Someone who's not a Christian, who does not believe in God, is going to approach the Bible with a completely different set of presuppositions. And when they read about Jesus walking on the water or multiplying the loaves and fishes or raising the dead, they're going to come up with a completely different explanation for those events consistent with a naturalistic worldview that rejects the possibility of supernatural intervention. Our biases influence how we interpret the evidence. So we have evidence and we have its interpretation. And we must always remember and keep a bit of humility in our hearts and in our minds as we look at the evidence, because we all have some kind of bias. We have presuppositions and assumptions that we bring to the task of interpretation, and we need to know what those are. We need to raise those to the level of consciousness so that we think through them and ask ourselves, now, does the evidence match my presuppositions and my assumptions? And if it doesn't, do I need to adjust the text or do I need to adjust my presuppositions? And that's a tough call. That's a tough challenge, but we have to do that if we're going to interpret the Bible clearly and properly. And so that brings us to a discussion of interpretation of the text. Various hermeneutical approaches have been used throughout the centuries. Early in the life of the church, allegory was very, very popular. Allegory was popularized, first of all, by Philo the Jew, who lived in Alexandria. He used allegorical interpretation to make the Old Testament in Greek, the Septuagint, relevant and understandable to a Greek audience in Egypt. From Philo, the early church fathers in Egypt picked up the practice of allegorical interpretation of the text. All of the church fathers, to some degree, tend to use some allegorical interpretation. In Asia Minor and Syria, in Antioch, the Antiochian school uses less allegory, but they don't use a purely grammatical historical approach either. They use just a more chastened allegorical approach than, say, Origen and Clement would in Egypt. So this allegorical approach gives rise ultimately to the fourfold method that's used in the Roman Catholic Church, where there's 4 levels of interpretation that are to be sought in any passage of Scripture. Then with the Renaissance and the renewal of learning and thought in the late Middle Ages, we see the beginning development of the grammatical historical approach to interpretation. And this grammatical historical approach really gets its firm footing from Nicholas of Lyra, who lived in the 1400s and who was a Jewish convert to Christianity. And his writings influenced Martin Luther, and from there influenced the Reformation in how the reformers interpreted and understood Scripture. And so we have the beginnings of the grammatical historical approach and the rejection of allegorical interpretation on the part of Protestantism. Now, moving on down into modern times, we have an approach called authorial intent. What did the author of the text intend to communicate? What was he trying to say? This approach in literature was advocated and advanced in the 20th century by E.D. Hirsch. It was picked up on by Robert Stein, a New Testament scholar under whom I studied at Southern Seminary and who used to teach at Bethel. Robert Stein advanced this in his book, Playing by the Rules, in which he took basically E.D. Hirsch's approach and simplified it a little bit and applied it to biblical interpretation. It's an excellent book. I encourage you to get it and read it, Playing by the Rules by Robert Stein. Good book on biblical interpretation using the authorial intent approach. There are, of course, a variety of naturalistic approaches, non-supernatural approaches that have been used since the time of the Enlightenment down to the present. And we don't have time to go into all of those, but they're touched on in your textbook. There are postmodern approaches, deconstruction of the text, all of this sort of thing. These are approaches also that are in use today. And lastly, among evangelicals, there's a new movement, theological interpretation of the text, where the text is viewed from the perspective of an ancient church document known as the Rule of Faith. The Rule of Faith was an ancient church confession that ultimately developed into what we know today as the Apostles' Creed. And it is an attempt, the theological interpretation of the text is the attempt to read the text consistent with the ancient doctrinal affirmations of the church that have maintained their steady hold on the church throughout 2,000 years of church history. There are certain things that all Christians, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, we all agree on, and they can be found in this ancient document, the Rule of Faith. And so the theological interpretation of the Bible, there's a whole commentary series coming out on that, and you'll see me refer to those in my notes sometimes. It's a useful and profitable approach to the text with this qualifier. There's the tendency sometimes when we do this sort of thing to read into the text something that really isn't there. We have to be careful. So that brings us to the issue of interpretation and misinterpretation. Interpretation involves what we call exegesis. Exegesis is a Greek word that means to draw out from the text what is there. We want to find what the meaning is in the text and draw it out. Eisegesis, on the other hand, another Greek word, reading into the text what we want to find. If I come to the text assuming that it teaches a certain thing, guess what I'm likely to find there? I'm likely to find exactly what I'm looking for because I'm going to read it into the text if I don't discipline myself to watch out for that sort of thing. So we do have to be careful about some of these approaches that we don't read into the text what we want to find. We need to talk for a moment about the place of translations and paraphrases in the task of interpretation. A translation is an attempt to take the document in one language and bring it over into another language and communicate clearly and accurately its meaning. And so some translations are more word for word, some are more thought for thought, and there's a trade-off there. Word for word gives us more closely what the words were that the original writer used. But when we're talking about idioms and figures of speech and metaphors and things like this, that may not be the best way to translate because it may miss the point. We may miss a tongue-in-cheek comment if we're too word for word. So sometimes we need that thought for thought kind of translation, and a good translation tries to strike a middle ground between the two. The more word for word translation, for instance, would be the ESV. The more thought for thought would be the NIV. Something in the middle would be the ESV, which is what we're using in this class. So translations help us to the degree that they accurately reflect the text. A paraphrase, however, is not a translation at all. It is a person or a committee's interpretation of the text. So when you're reading a paraphrase, you're actually reading somebody else's interpretation of the text. And that puts a layer of interpretive thought between you and the text that can actually interfere with your ability to interpret the text accurately. So we're not going to be using a paraphrase in this class because each of these has a different effect on how we do biblical interpretation. A paraphrase may actually cloud our interpretive work, where a translation hopefully will not. Now, as we approach the task of interpretation, we need to recognize that the Bible has different types of literature. There's historical literature. The Gospels and Acts are principally intended to be read as historical literature. Granted, they have a theological intent to them, but they are still history. Paul's letters and other letters are correspondences. The book of Hebrews may actually be a sermon rather than a letter. There's parables within the Gospels. A parable is a short story designed to teach a single truth. And we find these. There's apocalyptic literature primarily in the book of Revelation. And this is highly symbolic, very difficult to interpret. You get a lot of disagreement on what the book of Revelation means. And it's going to be interesting when we get there to talk about that. And we have figures of speech throughout the New Testament. There are figures of speech, and we need to understand those if we're going to appreciate them properly and interpret the text accurately. So, as you approach the text, how do you read the text? What's my advice on how to read the text? First of all, I suggest you approach the text prayerfully. Give it prayerful consideration as you read. Read it sympathetically. Don't come to it with a hostile mindset. Try to enter into the world in which they lived as you read the text. Take into account the type of literature. Is this a letter? Is this a parable? What is this? Is it apocalyptic? Take into account the kind of literature it is as you seek to interpret it. Remember also that the chapter and verse divisions were added later. They're not part of the original text, and sometimes they're unfortunate. And the verse divisions were the last to be added, close to the time of the Protestant Reformation. So just bear that in mind as you're dealing with the text. And ask yourself, as you read the text, ask yourself, how would the original audience have understood this text? How would they have read it? How would they have heard it? What would they have understood the biblical writer to be saying? Those kinds of things will help you as you approach the biblical text to understand it more clearly. That concludes the first lectures for Module 1.